Hi. I'm still learning about how to do this. This is a great platform. Hello there. Who's here with us? Let's see. A couple of different folks. Hey everyone, I'm going to start off with a little poll while people are joining. Let's see if I can figure out how to do it. Ricky, can you see this poll? Is it what folks see? Fantastic. Well, hello everyone. My name is Ashlea. I'm so excited to be here with you. I'm in my office in Seattle, Washington, United States, where it is, I live pretty much in a cloud. So coming at me through the windows is clouds that are kind of below where I am. So it's a very strange, overcast day. And for the next few minutes, I'd love to have folks fill in the survey questions about where you are, so that I know a little bit more about the communities that you're coming from, and also how to describe, what brings you to the course today. So excited to have everyone. Let's see. So there's some beginners. There's an individual here. Yes, please fill in the survey. Okay, so there's some beginners. Let's see how if I can get these answers. Where folks, some beginners, some people who know what the different types of disabilities are. Let's see. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so while everyone's kind of coming together, I think that this conference is going to be, I thought that it was going to be more interactive where I could see everyone. Ricky, will I be able to see everyone, or is it just me facing everyone else?
You facing everyone.
Okay. So I'm seeing that I'm going to be able to see where everyone is. Let's see. Okay. I'm facing the audience. They will write me in your questions. Okay. Well, so does anyone, while we're waiting for a few more folks to join, does anybody have any questions about disabilities or what it means to leave no one behind? Does anyone have any questions they wanted to make sure that they asked throughout this conference, and then I can be sure to answer them? It's a good time to make sure that I'll be able to see all of the questions that you have. So if you come into this conference with a little bit of a specific question, I'd love to know a little bit more about what you're looking for. Okay. And I'm going to end voting on the poll so I can see everyone else. Let's see. I want to see what people said. Yes. Okay. I'm not quite sure how to get the answers to the poll for where people live. And so would you mind posting in the chat, please, so I can see in real time where people are coming from? I'm sorry, I'm not able to see the results. Aha. Okay, Cologne, Zurich, Iceland, Germany, Frankfurt. Hi, hey there. Malta, hi. I've been wondering how your farm is going, Annalisa. Morocco, welcome. Let's see, France, Iceland. Wonderful. Okay, so everyone, hello and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. My name is Ashlea Elliott, and I am the CEO of Ashlea Elliott Consulting, which includes the Elliott ecosystem to accelerate peace, equity, and inclusion around the world. So I have been traveling around the world for the last few years, learning a little bit more about what types of exclusions and barriers people face all around the world, and working with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals with organization Junior Chamber International, as well as leading both for the United States and globally the Peace is Possible program. And about 4 years ago, I founded the Peace is Possible Global Peace Coalition, which includes leaders from 166 and more countries and a few places that are not quite countries, but they're working on having their autonomy from larger states. And there's a huge reach. So partnered with other organizations like Peace One Day, World Cleanup Day. Who are our other partners? Let's see. Oh, the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizenship. And so all together, we got together on Peace Day. And this year had just an enormous, I think the number is 785 million people participated on Peace Day, which is September the 21st, in whatever ways they were able to kind of come together. And so I love reaching out to people from all around the world. All of the teams that I'm on are global. And so it's really exciting for me to see that there's a global audience right now. It looks like there's mostly folks from Europe. And so that's very helpful because I've been looking at some of the information about disability inclusion across Europe. And today's conversation is going to be focused on how to leave no one behind when it comes to disability inclusion. And so 1 out of 5 people, so between 15 and 20% of the global population of the world, far over 1 billion people on the planet have disabilities. So I myself am a person with disability, multiple disabilities. I am sometimes hearing impaired. And also have PTSD from long-term trauma. So I have different types of both physical and mental disabilities. But one thing that I wanted to raise, because there's a couple of people who said that they're a beginner, is that there's about 6 categories of people with disabilities. And so there can be a visual impairment, there could be a hearing impairment. Some people have a speech and language or communication-based disability. And this speech and communication base could include people who are on the autism spectrum, who have a difficult time communicating what they need. There's also mobility disabilities, which means that a person will need to use a wheelchair, either some or part of the time. And then there's ambulatory as well, which could mean that a person has lost a limb. It is because it's such a large number, over 1 billion people who have different disabilities. The disability community is the most diverse group of people on Earth. And so as far as a social identity group, it's also the most interesting because a lot of times your identity is something that is formed, and it's maybe something that follows you throughout life. You know, when it comes to gender or sex, whether it comes to sexual orientation, race, these are different things that typically follow throughout life, although there are definitely some exceptions. And so while you may always have kind of some stability in your social identity, what's really interesting about being part of the disability community is that it's the most permeable, which means that you may be able-bodied for most of your life or parts of your life and then become disabled. You may have a disability and then become able-bodied. You may be temporarily disabled. So this could include, a lot of places throughout the world consider pregnancy to be a state of disability. And so that depends on how your state organizes their benefits. Here in the United States, people, we don't have any maternal or paternity leave nationwide. So people will enact temporary disabilities. You can have a temporary disability also after a climate-related natural disaster or a natural disaster or terrorist attack. And then also a lot of people who have experienced conflict or maybe an earthquake, tsunami, depending on where you are, they can also become disabled in the process of being displaced. And so it's a really interesting conversation because it's so diverse. And so you could be a completely able-bodied person while you're younger and then become disabled at any time. And so a couple of things that could happen is you could be part of the world population who suffers from a degenerative disease like multiple sclerosis, or also ALS, which some people learned about during the Ice Bucket Challenge a few years ago, which is a deterioration. Also people who experience Parkinson's disease. And so these can be neurological, degenerative diseases. You can also have people who you meet around the world who are part of a different type of degenerative disease, which relates to their body and their muscles, and the way that they're able to operate their body. And so this could be people who have a very difficult time swallowing. There's some people who have a very difficult time breathing. Also, kind of using your tongue to chew, and so swallowing. I have friends who are swallowing experts because it's such a big problem for so many people around the world. There's also a lot of disabilities that would require someone to have an assistant. And so there's kind of grades of disability as well, as far as how easily you're able to function independently, related to how much help and assistance you might need. And so there's a lot of people in the disability community who require an aid with them, either part of the time or some of the time. And what's really important to know about that is when we start talking about leaving people behind, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but having access to sanitation. So some people, if they're able to use the restroom on their own independently and able to take care of their hygiene and sanitation independently, they may require special access. So if you're in need of having wheelchair access, or if you use a walker or assistive device for mobility to access hygienic services and sanitation, so to wash your hands, can be particularly difficult to use the restroom independently. And other people need to use diapers or need to use a catheter or a different type of system to help them go to the bathroom. And so there is a huge variety. And so oftentimes there's individuals who may have more than one underlying condition. And I work a lot in the peace space. And so there's also a type of, and so it's actually something that happened to me, is I developed autoimmune disability where my body thinks that I'm allergic to everything. And so my body is so damaged from trauma. And so something to understand a little bit more about persons who are welcome Tunisia, who are in refugee camps or who have been internally displaced because of political upheaval or even a climate-related event, is that their bodies may start kind of acting against themselves. And so on one side of this is a cancer where maybe the body isn't responding enough to some of the cells that are growing. And on the other side, you have people who have these autoimmune diseases in which the body starts to attack itself and anything that interrelates with the body. And that could be food. If you are, one of your hormones kind of in your body from your endocrine system starts going off, then your body will start to attack itself. And so there's a lot of people around the world who have kind of clusters of disabilities. And so that's something to really pay attention to. And so the focus of today's conversation is about what does it mean to leave no one behind when we start talking about persons with disabilities around the world. And I really want to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. And so in the chat, Can you rate your knowledge of the Sustainable Development Goals from, let's say, 0 is you don't know what they are, to 3, which is you know what the Sustainable Development Goals are, but you're not sure how they would relate to disabilities or inclusion. And then 5 is you do have a solid understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals and how the inclusion framework works. Can you rate yourselves for me, 1 to 5? 4, 3. Helpful. Okay. I'm seeing some 3s, some 4s. I have 1.5. I like that you made it 1.5 instead of just 1. That's awesome. Okay. So people are aware of what the Sustainable Development Goals are. That's fantastic. And let's see. Okay. So when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals and human rights and also inclusion, a lot of people have questions about what does inclusion mean when it has, when it interrelates with the Sustainable Development Goals. And so overall, there's 3 very important types of inclusion. So that's political inclusion, financial or economic inclusion, and social inclusion. Type a star if you've heard of those before, if you're familiar with them. And a minus if you don't know what they mean. Okay, fantastic. So I'm getting a lot of stars. Thank you so much for interacting. So there are people on the call who understand both what the Sustainable Development Goals are and also that there's social and political and economic inclusion. And so that's kind of the easiest part of this conversation. I like that star, Claudia. That's a nice star. Because another element of the huge 1 billion people on Earth who have disabilities is that when we're talking about the social, economic, and political inclusion of persons with disabilities, and also understanding how huge of how dynamic this community is and how people can kind of come into it, kind of come out of it, how it changes over time, all the different ways that it can present itself and also be cumulative. Something that we also need to consider is that persons that have disability, because there's so many, it also is interrelated with other elements of social identity. And so it can be related to your race, your gender, your sex, your sexual orientation, your class, in some places your caste. And there's a lot of different elements. And so when it comes to leaving no one behind and talking a little bit more about the social, economical, and political inclusion of individuals with disabilities, it's really an intersectional lens in which there is no one size that's going to fit all. And so there is a classification for this type of problem, and that it's more complex than complex. And so it's probably considered a wicked problem. And a wicked problem means that it is a dynamic, constantly changing problem. And the problem being the exclusion of persons with disabilities and the different types of solutions that people will need depending on where you are and depending on the whole identity of the person that you're trying to work with or the group of people that you want to work with who may have disabilities in your community. Is that it's going to constantly change. There will never be one type of solution that will make things better in every area around the world. It will need to be regionally specific. And so I'm glad that we have someone here from both Morocco and Tunisia, as well as leaders from Europe. And what's important about that is that what's going to work in Europe, I've been all across Europe and I've seen a lot of really great efforts for inclusion for persons with disabilities. And also, when I've gone in different places in Africa and South America, even in the United States, there's a difference in the level of accessibility that people have. And so it's really good to also have the different identity groups, both for folks who are in Europe, as well as in Northern Africa, who I'm seeing here. And so when we think about exclusions, Can everyone type in a type of exclusion that you think a person might experience if they're a person with disability? What kind of things come to mind for you when you're thinking about barriers that people may have? And so an exclusion, just to make it very clear, is any type of barrier or any type of something that's going to block people's access to either meeting their basic needs or to fulfilling their full potential. And so can anyone in the comments write an example of something that you've seen or heard about or thought about as a barrier for persons with disabilities? Okay. Thank you, Svava. Yes, I am wearing my regular sunglasses, or my regular glasses so you can see my eyes, but typically I need to wear sunglasses because the lights are very disruptive to my eyes. I get headaches. So also the noises, that's a great example. Nicole, that's a very good example, not entrusting someone with challenging tasks to protect them because of their disabilities. That's called infantilizing. And it's a type of parentalism which is very limiting to persons in the community that have disabilities. You know what, Maria? I'm so glad that you said that. I was looking for the closed captioning option on here, and I couldn't find, she's shared that persons who are deaf and blind would have a difficult time with this platform, and you're absolutely correct. I wasn't sure how to turn on closed captioning. And then it's very, very important, you're right, that people that would be deaf and hard of hearing would have a hard time accessing this platform and this webinar right now. I do hope, just so that you know, that I will transcribe. They're recording this, and I'll provide the transcriptions so that we can do captionings after this recording is finished. And I'll try to also make sure that it will work with a visual reader. But that's fantastic. A lot of people are working from home right now. And so do we have the adaptive technologies, and are our websites and platforms accessible for all people? Access to the arts and culture and consumption of artistic works. That's fantastic. As a woman, not allowed being able to go into some service clubs. Okay. All right, fantastic. So I really appreciate you all kind of chipping in and sharing your ideas of different types of exclusions. And so I want to relate this back again to peace and the 8 different pillars of positive peace that I train folks on from the Institute of Economics and Peace. And something that's really important to focus on is sometimes the barriers that exist for persons who have disabilities in your community that you've mentioned, accessibility issues, not being able to participate, people not trusting them. And another part of what you've mentioned, I just really want to acknowledge, is that sometimes if a person has a disability that is visual impairment, audio impairment, mobility related, people making this, or even communications related, people who have another element of being in the disability community is sometimes your disability is chronic. So it's all the time. You're constantly dealing with, this is just a daily experience for you. Sometimes it's acute, which means earlier I mentioned like a short-term disability, but sometimes it has like a flare-up where you'd be okay, but then suddenly something will happen and you'll be in a situation where you're going to be really, really sick. And so this can be related to like Crohn's disease or other types of spikes in what your body is doing, but the rest of the time you're fine. And so something that Nicole has just mentioned is people also make an assumption that a person with a disability wouldn't be able to take on these more difficult tasks or maybe a leadership position. I just found out that there's only 17 countries in the world where a person with a disability with no restrictions is eligible to run for office. And so having a disability does not mean that you have any intellectual impairment unless you happen to be part of the disability community who has an intellectual disability or delay. And this could be, hello, Ghana, welcome. And so some members of the community who are part of the disability community, but they have no other impairments when it comes to their cognitive and communication skills, then that can be particularly frustrating when people make assumptions about the types of lives that they could lead, their independent ability to do things for themselves, also their leadership capacity. And I have seen internationally, I always get really excited when I find other people with disabilities in an organization or in an elected position, because we're just missing. We're missing, and there's so much potential for persons with disabilities to be involved and included and to bring these really great ideas, and that infantilizing of them is a huge barrier. Not being able to learn or work like others, that's a very helpful what if you learn differently? So one of the reasons that I'm a CEO, and it's just me facing you, I'm just looking at myself, I can't see you all, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself, is that I am an autodidact polymath, and I'm able to learn anything. I can learn anything, and I can pick up new information and new topics, and my brain is pretty much a computer because of head trauma. And so I have these special skills, but I can't learn like anyone else. I can't just sit in a classroom. If someone is just going to talk to me, if I was in a situation like this, and so I have some slides to make it more visual in a moment, but just for an introduction, if someone's talking to me, I have no idea what's happening. Really, I need it to move. I'm a kinesthetic global learner, which makes things even harder to learn. And so I need to be in it to understand how the parts move and what people are talking about. But my auditory processing is almost nothing. And so that's very important as far as your learning skills. Thank you for mentioning that. Lack of knowledge of how to use technology is extremely important. Thank you for joining. Hi. And oh yes, of course. The hero syndrome of being inspirational for living your life while having a disability. Yeah, this is something that comes up quite frequently, where it's called disability porn. And it is a real problem. And so there is a fine line. So someone's talking here about how when someone who has a disability does something, whether they're putting their pants on, because sometimes putting pants on is really hard. I have friends who are paraplegics, and they have a special way to get dressed, or people who are public speakers, or they go out and do something really remarkable. They're already a remarkable person. They just happen to have a disability, but that's not the way that people talk about them. And it is a huge problem around the world when people make memes and videos where they'll say, if this person without arms and legs, or this person who's deaf and blind can accomplish it, then I can accomplish it, and they're a hero and they're amazing, when really they're just a person who's living in their life, and they should be able to do all of those things, because our systems should make it possible for people to do whatever is their fullest potential. And so I wanted to bring back in the understanding of violence. And so across the world, a lot of people would see these different types of inequalities. And I'm going to go through some pictures from the Sustainable Development Goals in a few minutes to show you some of the inequities and some of the barriers that people face that may not be top of mind for you. But when we're going to go through this list in a minute, I want to talk to you a little bit more about direct, structural, and cultural violence. And it relates to some of these comments as well. And it also relates to the fact that people who have disabilities have really multidimensional identities. And so someone's not only able to go into a club, people who can't access services, whether it has to do with, when we talk about the persons who have disabilities and their economic status, accessing certain things where they'd have to pay versus, accessing it physically, or if you have a hearing or a vision impairment, accessing the material. And a lot of this comes because of structural violence. And so there's 3 different types of violence. The first is direct violence. And so it is important to talk about the fact that people who have, you can't hear anything. Okay, Ricky, there's someone who's having a difficult time hearing something. And so there are acts of direct violence, which could be killing, abuse, sexual assault, stalking, murder. These are things that impact persons with disability, and all around the world, people who have disabilities are at a greater risk of experiencing violence. This is particularly a problem. Direct violence is particularly a problem for children. And there is some sort of, I'm not going to read you all the statistics because I'm a computer and I'll just keep telling you data. But people who are abused physically and psychologically, emotionally, financially, because they have a disability is endemic in every country in the world. It's a problem. And so this can also happen if you have someone who's not able to communicate what they need, they're not able to tell other people the types of abuse that they're experiencing. Here in the United States, we had a situation where there's people who, if someone is in a home where they may have, they may no longer have cognitive ability, but they were pregnant because they were sexually assaulted, and people who can't speak up for themselves, but even just having a disability, which relates back to thinking that someone has a lower cognitive ability just because they have a disability. So those all fall into the line of direct violence. And the number for people who are also interested in gender equality, the relationship between gender and disability cannot be separated. And so women and girls who have a disability, their numbers, their statistics of the violence that they encounter is staggering. It is staggering. But also people who have become disabled so people who are already disabled and women are at a higher risk of intimate partner violence, which is direct violence. And also people who are women who've experienced different types of violence, direct violence, become disabled. And so there's that relationship there between direct violence and persons with disabilities. And then there's also the biggest barrier really for persons with disabilities is structural and cultural violence. And it's the beliefs and the attitudes that people have about persons with disabilities. And so as we're kind of going to move forward about how to leave no one behind and how to include people, to really think about, what types of attitudes and beliefs are held about persons with disabilities. And we've heard a couple of them that, people aren't able to hold leader position, maybe have a certain type of job. A lot of places in the world, particularly for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, they are cut off. They are just not presented. They are fully capable of communicating. They don't have a problem cognitively connecting language or connecting thought to language and receiving information and expressing information. They are fully capable of doing this. However, there is stigma and discrimination and beliefs that persons who have, especially deaf and hard of hearing, which is most of the time persons who are deaf and hard of hearing have the most barriers in societies, depending on where they live, to interact because of language. But in places around the world, specifically in Kenya and some other areas that are already least resourced, they just are not provided either with basic sign language or technologies or adaptive devices. There's just not enough preventative efforts. This is actually a really big problem in Nepal with children who have autism and adults who have autism. And they're completely capable of interacting using assistive technologies or using American Sign Language and expressing what they need and what they want, but they never have that opportunity to communicate their thoughts, their needs, their desires. And you could have someone who has an absolutely incredible innovation, who would be able to really transform the world with their ideas, but they're never taught to communicate at all. And that makes my heart, it hurts so much, because this is such a problem everywhere. And other people who would be able to contribute their ideas, but there's these structural barriers. And so the structural barriers could be laws, and I'm reading through all the laws for all the areas in the country or in the world, and there's a lack of laws preventing discrimination. There's a lack of really sustainable systems-wide initiatives to eliminate these biases and attitudes and beliefs that people have about persons with disabilities, that prevents them from accessing jobs, school. Around the world, people who have disabilities are disproportionately in poverty and also disproportionately experiencing hunger. I'm going to try not to tell you all the statistics and just kind of stay high level, but it is everywhere. And so all people who have disabilities, unless you're in an area or a region that has specific non-discrimination laws, is at a disadvantage when it comes to these structural barriers, whether it's laws or policies that don't specifically prevent discrimination for you, that don't particularly and explicitly say that you have the right to go to school and a right to education and a right to be in the workforce. There's a lot of places throughout the world where people who have disabilities are completely excluded from any type of workforce, because people have not thought about or put into place infrastructure that can make it possible for people to get from wherever they are to where they would need to go for education, for food, for sanitation and hygiene. People who can't walk to get water, people who can't walk if there's only a community restroom, they can't get there. And once they do get there, they can't get inside. And so there's so many different levels. Yes, so Sava has just said that there's a British definition of disability, that you're being disabled due to the society and barriers related to that. Absolutely. And so it is related to human rights, how to make sure we leave no one behind when it comes to persons with disabilities. It is related to both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also there is a convention of the human rights of persons with disabilities as well, and it's celebrating its. I think it's been about how many years is it? It's been around for a little while, but there's been some really big changes and transformations over the last 10 years to really fight back against that belief that. Someone mentioned earlier that infantilizing, even preventing people who have disabilities from going to places because they could get hurt or because something could happen to them. And so people are just limited by structures and cultural beliefs when they're not actually limited. They could completely go. If they had access to inclusive design, inclusive policies, inclusive infrastructure, if they had the technology that they needed to interact with the world, they would be completely capable and are completely capable. A person who is blind is capable of doing any job that doesn't require them to have vision, and even some jobs that do require you to have vision if you have the right adaptive technologies. And so we're in a really cool moment of history where there is a lot of adaptive technologies out there. I live in the Seattle area, and there's so many adaptive technologies here. And also in countries who use a lot of ICT or ICT for D technologies, they're working really hard to make it more accessible for persons with disabilities. But so what I wanted to make as far as a point right in that comment is, if we were to leave no one behind, it's not just about access. And so I was just watching, I have Netflix. I'm not sure if you all have Netflix, but there's this fantastic documentary. It's called Crip Camp. And it's about the people who in the United States, because it's different for every area, who kind of came together to have this evolution for people with disabilities of the things that they could do. They totally had a sit-in, and you had quadriplegic, you had paraplegic, you had people with who were hearing impaired, you had everybody who had you had people who had cerebral palsy, and also people in this also had polio, who had a sit-in and who took over a building in order to get policies passed because they were completely capable of doing all of those things that relate to advocacy and changing policies and changing mindsets. And so if you have a chance on Netflix to watch Crip Camp, it's fantastic. And it talks a little bit about fighting against some of these barriers. And it also talks about how I saw that a couple people are interested in hosting different types of events and making sure that they're accessible for other people. But it's not just about access. It's not just about bathrooms. It's also about making sure that people who have disabilities are completely consulted and active participants in any effort, project, policy, initiative, education, technology, whatever it may be, to relate to the community of persons with disabilities. And so there is this incredible quote, and it's from the United Nations Deputy Chief, Amina Mohammed, that says, "Improved accessibility is the precondition for full inclusion and meaningful participation of persons with disabilities." And so in the work that I've done, working with the different organizations, accessibility, access, ability for people to go to the bathroom, ramps, hearing assistive technologies, that's just the first step. That's just the step that keeps people from accessing their basic needs. That's all kind of related at that direct violence level. The next step of inclusion starts afterwards. So once you get people who are in the room, or once you get people who they do have access, then how are they going to be able to overcome structural violence and reach their full potential? So I'm going to try to get to presentation. Okay. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. Also, people mentioned the Special Olympics. Thank you so much. It's good to see all these yeses. Special Olympics are fantastic. They were held a few miles from where I am last year or the year before, and it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary because we had a lot of people come out who are part of the disability community, and all of the service providers to make sure that everybody really understood that the people who were competing in these different events also wanted to be at press conferences. They wanted to be part of the rules. They wanted to be involved in every aspect of the Special Olympics because, you know, even if it's part of their body or their ability to communicate, that they still have these other ways to contribute to how things are done. And so across the world, no matter where you are, unless there are specific policies in place, all persons with disabilities will have a difficult time without specific interventions accessing food. And so SDG 1 has to do with no poverty. SDG 2 has to do with no one goes hungry. And so that's universal, that people who happen to be in the community of persons with disabilities, this is a problem. Access to your health and well-being across the planet in every place, in some places much more than others, persons with disabilities have a difficult time accessing healthcare that they need, and they may also need specialized healthcare. They also may need healthcare to come into the home, and they may need people who are personal assistants or care assistants to help them with things like showering, getting dressed. They may need access to different types of transportation to get them to and from, but access to healthcare, poverty and hunger, as well as access to universal education for every person who has a disability. All of those, it's universally a problem. And as we've also mentioned briefly, women and the gender inequality is also correlated with persons with disabilities at a much more aggravated rate. And so SDGs 1 through 5 is across the board. You know what? Sexual wellness and reproductive rights is often not discussed in healthcare for people with disabilities. That is true. And that is one of the special rights for the Convention for Rights for Persons with Disabilities. And that is that people have a right to privacy, that they have a right to intimate relationships, and that they have a right to reproductive freedom. And so that is especially important for people who are in this population who may be particularly vulnerable for not having that type of privacy or being allowed to have their sexuality realized. And so what I want to go through with everyone is different barriers. So everyone for the SDGs, SDG 1 through SDG 5, is going to affect all persons with disabilities unless there's specific interventions in place. And so I want to start with SDG 16. So SDG 16 is focused on, and so I want to work kind of from the outside of the system to the inside of the system of what would be necessary to make sure that people with disabilities are not left behind. And another part of that too is do no harm. And so the two main values of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is leave no one behind, which we're talking about, and also do no harm, which relates again to that different type of structural and cultural as well as direct violence. But when we're talking about what would need to be done and what countries, cities, organizations need to do in order to make sure that persons with disabilities are included, exclusions can happen. There's the big ones. We talked about earlier, everyone's familiar with economic, social, and political exclusion, but there's also participatory, there's religious exclusions or relational or who you know or who you have access to, and all of the knowledge, which is part of social capital of those networks of people that you know. And so when people are also blocked off from interacting and they're isolated, they're not able to access the information from different networks. And so there's some really interesting information about what's happening right now as it relates to COVID-19 and the isolation that and the disruption to lives that people with disabilities are encountering at an unprecedented rate throughout the globe. But from the outside in, how do we start ensuring that people with disabilities are included? The first things that we need to talk about are in SDG 16, which relates to peace, access to justice, and also inclusive organizations, which are also transparent. And people also have the ability to share feedback with those organizations so that they can make better policies. And so SDG 16, Goal 6, is developing effective, accountable, and transparent institutions. And this is really important because there's only, I think it's 17 countries in the world where people who have disabilities, there's no limits on persons with disabilities to participate in voting or to participate in interacting with their elected officials to tell them more about what they need. And so from the very outset, before you can have these kind of non-discriminatory laws, which usually requires advocacy, you need to have effective, accountable, and transparent institutions. And so when it comes to positive peace, this is the pillar called well-functioning government. Well-functioning government, low levels of corruption, and those are some things that are really, really important to have as the next step. So once you kind of think about access, okay, what's the first step of leaving no one behind? It's making sure that these institutions are ready to make changes and to make it possible for people who have disabilities to be part of the decision-making process, because right now they're left out. And then 16B, SDG 16B, is to promote and enforce non-discriminatory laws and policies. And so this is the next step too, to say, okay, the first step is to make sure that we have a well-functioning government that's going to listen and be transparent. So you'll tell people, and so that transparency could be, how do you get a law changed? How do you change a policy? How do you interact? You know, what are the platforms that you interact with to engage with your elected officials? Or if you live in a monarchy or a place where there's dynasties or reigns of people, how do you interact with them? How do you interact with the ministries that you need to push forward these non-discriminatory laws and policies? And so as to the comment earlier about interacting for people who are deaf and visually impaired, if it's a website, if it's a call center, how do people interact? How do they find out the information about how to interact with their government too? And so it's not only having a government that's ready to have these conversations, it's also making sure that the communication methods that the government is using is really is really accessible and inclusive to get the process started. So then the next step would be to promote and enforce the non-discriminatory laws and policies. And so this could have to do with the education, making sure that all people with disabilities have access to education. It could come to financing. And so there's some great statistics, I can share them with you after this conference, about the additional costs that families have if they have a member who has a disability. Or if you're in a family that has multiple persons with disabilities, additional funding that you should receive, or maybe receive part of a Social Security or social safety net, depending on where you live and the way that your government is kind of organized. And so how do you start having these non-discriminatory laws, which starts talking about that structural violence? And so if people believe children or adults who become disabled, it's just heartbreaking sometimes. I'm thinking right now about women who, especially women who are younger, who have childbirth at a younger age and then have a fistula, which means that they're no longer able to control what's happening when it regards to their bladder or their intestines, and so and also their uterus, and so they may involuntarily be eliminating through all the exits of the body simultaneously, and they're just shunned. And so when it comes to communities that have very high levels of superstition, some people believe that people who are born with a disability, it's because of witchcraft and they should kill them. This is particularly a problem for people who have albinism. Across the world, there's increased violence because there's some superstitions related to persons who have albinism. And if you take off a part of their body, then it will help cure HIV and AIDS. There's some other beliefs, superstitions too. And so how do you get those laws passed? And not only getting the laws passed at the high levels of your government. And so some people are here from small countries, some people are here from huge countries. How do you then make sure that those laws and policies are reality? And so throughout the world, there is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and there is the Convention of Human Rights for Persons with Disabilities. But how realistic, and there's also the Convention and the Ending of the Discrimination Against Women, Ending of Discrimination and Violence Against Women, CEDAW. But how realistic are these non-discrimination laws in practice for people on the ground every day? And so it's not just making sure that you have the laws and policies, but also that they're really happening on the ground. And so when it's time to have these laws, you need to have people in the room. And so if you are here as a member of an organization, if you work in a community group, at a school, in an institution, in a government, SDG 16.7 is that the people who are going to be on the receiving end of these policies, these non-discrimination policies, have to be included in their creation and modification, and also need to be part of the monitoring and feedback. And so the monitoring and evaluation processes of, is this really the experience that people are having on the ground? And so this, I would say, oftentimes SDG 16 is at the end, and so maybe people get tired before they get there and they don't see these. But for me, these are fundamental. And so, you can start thinking about accessibility, but really this is the foundation that people need to have to start ensuring that people who have disabilities are not left behind. If you have any questions, or if I'm talking too fast, please put a note and I'll keep an eye on that. Okay, and so the next level, so as we're kind of moving our way in, we've just moved through one of the exclusions and barriers, which is participation and political inclusion. And so making sure that those people who are being part of what the laws, how the laws are being created, how the policies are being created, making sure they're part of that decision-making process, just being in the room gets through the participatory barrier of political exclusion. And then the next level is SDG 10.3 of ensuring equal opportunities and ending of discrimination. And so now you have a law or policy. You've had people who are part of that community, who are part of that decision-making. You need to ensure that this is distributed and that people who do not have disabilities and people who are in decision-making positions around the world, whatever level of organization you're in, even if you're an individual who just wants to be an advocate in the world, that this is where people who don't have disabilities really need to pay attention, that these laws, it's not just to protect the people and provide accessibility for persons with disabilities. The role of reducing inequalities and making sure that it's more equitable and leave no one behind falls on the people who, are the advocates from the disability community, but also people who are outside of that community who need to make changes and need to have changes in their beliefs and attitudes about persons with disabilities and make sure that they have equal opportunities. So this can be important when you get down to the grassroots level. And in positive peace, it's making sure that people accept the rights of others and making sure that there's high levels of human capital, making sure that people who have disabilities are getting to education that they deserve, that they are accessing the healthcare that they deserve, that they are accessing food and water and sanitation. And so the next step is to make sure that the social and economic inclusion, 10.2, that any other types of barrier that people who have disabilities are encountering, that we start dismantling them one by one, or across the entire system at every single stage of intersection between barriers and exclusions for people who have all these different types of disabilities. And so it really takes a holistic approach to making sure that the barriers are being removed. And so far, we have talked about political inclusion, making sure that those people who have disabilities are part of that decision-making process. That's political inclusion. Also making sure that when it gets down to the grassroots level, that within the community there's no more that there's actions against these types of beliefs. And so that's social inclusion and making sure that people who have disabilities aren't hidden away or locked, unfortunately, or institutionalized when they don't need to be. And so that starts having this social inclusion and removing some of those barriers. So once you have those non-discrimination laws or non-discriminatory laws, then you can start having the social inclusion of people, and that will open up the doors to the participation and the relationships that persons with disabilities have with larger networks like this global effort, and also the different types of social capital that come with that. And so the next step is economic inclusion. And so a lot of places in the world, the economic inclusion, there's so many barriers. There's just so many barriers for people who have disabilities participating fully in the workforce, whether it comes to them not having the ability to get out of their house and get to the place that they would work. Sometimes it's getting the right education, vocational education to go work somewhere. And so the next SDG target to focus on is 9.2, is to promote the inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and to prepare all of the employers in all of the cities and all of the ways that people get around when it comes to like mobility and moving things around. Also, when it comes to like crossing the street, if you're in a wheelchair, that you have kind of divots so that you can roll. For people who are blind, there are often on sidewalks, you'll see raised bumps so that people know that they're getting close to the edge of the concrete, of the sidewalk, so they don't walk into the street. And then for persons who have hearing loss, that they're able to press a button, and maybe it tells them, like, if you press to cross the street, it'll make a noise. Sometimes it's very annoying. And then it'll say like safe to cross. And so making sure that the entire workforce industry and also your infrastructure is ready for people who have disabilities to participate. And so that also relates to target 9.1 and making sure that that infrastructure is really in place so that people can get around. And so first you need people to have, first is the political, and then it's the social, and then it's the economic. And for people who have communication disorders, who also may be hearing impaired, people who have intellectual disabilities or other types of disabilities where they need to point to a picture. So this works really well. I follow and am friends with a couple of people who are really snarky, like they're funny, really funny. Stephen Hawking was a really good example of this, and he uses an adaptive technology after his voice box was damaged from ALS. And so making sure that people have access to the types of technology innovations that they need to communicate and to participate in the world. And so there's a ton of adaptive technologies being put out there, and they let people interact. And so the next two stages, and so in order for people to really, if you have someone who has a difficult time communicating, but they would be able to communicate with you their ideas, their ingenuity, their needs, their concerns. If you're in a meeting with someone who needs to use an adaptive device, all they need is the adaptive device, and they could be on your workforce, then do it. And if you need to make sure that the infrastructure of your community and your cities is ready for them, then make sure that that's ready as well. And there's a lot of really cool technologies right now when it comes to machine learning algorithms. And this is a really fun part of artificial intelligence that I love, and it's related to beacons. And so this is something that has been used in airports, in shopping malls, in kind of the commercial sector for a long time. And what will happen is it's GPS related. And so when you pass a certain milestone within a community or city, your adaptive device can tell you, you can use it on Google Maps and it can tell you kind of where you are. But if you're a person who uses geolocation, for example, and you're trying to make sure you know where you are by the way things sound, but maybe there's construction, how do you get around that? And how do you get around the community? Or even if there's a parade or something, some other disruption to your daily route, then you'd be able to use these beacons so that when you pass a certain point in the community, there's like a sensor that will say, okay, you need to turn left here because there's a detour. And so this is something that's really, really fantastic because of the penetration of mobile devices around the world that I'm really excited about helping persons with disabilities. I use adaptive devices because I don't understand maps or directions. It's inverted in the way that I can process information. And so I'm really excited about this for my own personal use and also the use for other people and for their caregivers as well, who may be accompanying them. And then the next aspect is, so the next level of getting people to not be left behind is SDG 7.1, universal access to modern energy. And so there's a lot of people who, if you're going to make sure that someone has universal access to information and communication technologies, 9C, how are they going to, that's fantastic. But in reality, how realistic is that if the person is living somewhere under the poverty limit, usually twice under the poverty limit, and they don't have access to energy or electricity, or they have sporadic, so say that there's a person who has a disability and has this adaptive device, how good is that going to be in an area that's least resourced? And so 80% of the world's population of persons with disabilities, 80% lives in the least resourced countries. And so if you're in a least resourced country and you have either low broadband and low electricity and no access to water, how are you going to get an adaptive technology to work? And so it has to be a holistic approach, because if you provide 9C, but you don't provide 7.1, it's not going to work, because you'll have this really cool technology, but then people won't be able to use it. And so it has to be done in tandem. That's why I grouped it this way. And then also, so I think I might have 10.2 twice because it's so important. That there's absolutely, so 10.2 means that there are no barriers for persons who have disabilities to interact with, their full political engagement. So around the world right now, there are a lot of barriers for people to even vote. And I think I mentioned earlier that people can't run for office mostly around the world if they have a disability. There's some sort of barrier, but they can't get the information about how to vote or how to be part of a decision-making process because that information isn't shared with them in a way that is equitable. And so 10.2 is so important. It's the topic of this whole conversation, and I had to put it in there twice. And then the next one is target 11.2. So if you have people who have, so if you you have the policies and your government's on board, and now you have people who are able to participate, and now you have people who have adaptive devices in cities that allows them to get around, and they have the electronics and they have the electricity and the power to power these devices. Now you're ready to move towards the affordable and sustainable transportation systems. And so how are the people, if you have the beacons that help people maneuver around, okay, now they can maneuver around, you've worked on that, and you're also making sure that people, if there's an elevator in their building, that there's a lift, that the sidewalks, that people can kind of, if you are in a place that has sidewalks, because there's a lot of places that that doesn't exist. So the next step is to make sure that people can get transported to, so if we're going to move to 8.5, which is next, which is the full employment and decent work with equal pay, making sure that people can get from one place to the next. And so that means that your trains, your buses, your streets, your sidewalks, your roads, and in a lot of places in the world, this just is such, people who don't have disabilities don't have access to this. And so this is almost a surreal ask. And so it means that there's really a long way for us to go, because there's already so many barriers for people who don't have disabilities to get to work or to get around their communities, and people who don't have disabilities to access electricity. So this is one that I want to be careful with, because it's important, and it's also, it requires a lot more development and investment in those least resourced countries that have persons with disabilities who also don't have this yet themselves. And then the next step, as we kind of go towards development, is 8.5, and making sure that people who are working, who have disabilities, that they're paid equitably around the world. People who have disabilities who are put to work are paid marginally, if at all. And so once you do have people who come into the workforce, again, with that infantilizing comment, they don't get paid the same. There are not laws universally that protect that people get fair wages for their work. This also combined with race, class, caste, gender identity, sexual identity, and sexual orientation, and making sure that everyone gets paid equally. And so if you have a person who has a disability and is a cisgender man, compared to a woman who's also, let's say, of African descent or of Latinx or Asian descent, not European, Western European descent, are they being paid equitably? And so that's another area where you see a lot of those intersections. And also with 11.2, these two are correlated, because if you don't pay people enough to live within the city limits that you've had these affordable and sustainable transport systems put in, then it's not going to work. And so this really, really important, especially as we consider the rural nature and the ways that geography may be where you live, for making these things a reality, which is why they're so critical, and there has to be a huge amount of investment. The next one that I want to talk about as far as our next level of participation is two more from SDG 16. There's also, I'm seeing a comment that there's also, for people who are employed, that there's not always those adaptive technologies or those different types of accommodations. And that is a huge problem. And so if you are, for example, if you are hosting an event and you want to have a speaker come, or you want to have a participant come, they may not be coming from a place where they have those types of assisted devices. And so it's a lot more when it comes to your planning process and making sure that the people will have what they need, but also people just regularly interacting, they don't have what they need. I'll send you some resources on the current state of development for people with disabilities that has more details on that. But two more that I wanted to mention before I go to the last two slides is sometimes, so around the world, there's a huge number of people who have no legal identity. This is particularly relevant for people who live in the least resource areas of the world, people who have been displaced by conflict or natural disaster, and also persons with disabilities. And so none of the other things. So you won't be able or eligible to enroll in school. You won't be able to vote. You won't be able to get, if your government does provide funding for your food or for housing or for anything else, if you are not registered. And so a lot of people who have disabilities, because of those beliefs and attitudes we talked about earlier, they're not registered. If they don't receive like 16.2 abuse and violence, if they aren't exploited or trafficked, which is sometimes why there's no provision of legal identity, they will not be eligible for those different types of benefits. And so if there's funding in your country for people to have assistance care or different types of services, you're not eligible unless you have legal identity. And in a lot of places around the world, it's not only people who have a disability who do not have access to their legal identity. And so what I really love about this SDG particularly, and all of the things that we're talking about today, is that every single target that we've talked about today and every single element of inclusion for persons with disabilities also benefits everyone. It is universal design. It helps everyone because, as we mentioned, when it comes to universal access to modern energy, there's also a need to have universal access to water, which is SDG 6. And now here, when it comes to universal legal identity, all of the people who do not have these, if we start taking collective action to make sure that persons with disabilities have these things, it will also benefit the people that do not have disabilities in those areas who also are facing these types of inequities, and to create a more even distribution of resources for everyone. And so when it comes to, if anyone were to ask you, why should you have disability inclusion? Why should we take these special efforts? It's because including persons who have disabilities has a ricocheting effect, and it benefits everyone in societies that do not have these types of resources. And many of these resources are promised to us from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is an example of something that's promised to us, but that it's just not a reality on the ground, which leads us back to, if you have the policies in place and say, yeah, everyone has legal identity, but that's not a reality. So that's another part of what people will need to do. And then making sure that there are specific efforts to protect those children from abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and violence. And so if people are looking for a project or a way to get involved, there are very little resources out there for the rehabilitation and reintegration of persons who've been trafficked back into society. But there's almost no reintegration programs out there for persons who've been trafficked, who either because of being trafficked have a disability, or who were trafficked because they have a disability. But there's no specific programs that I'm aware of that serve this population to help them reintegrate and to get access to all of the things that they would need to be an included member of society. And so that's a huge area, is who's serving the disabled, exploited, trafficked children and adults also. And so then we move on to SDG 11, and this is talking more about having sustainable cities. And so earlier from this same SDG, we've seen, let's see, where are other ones that are the same color? We've seen the affordable and sustainable transportation systems. Also, if there's like a voucher or something that allows people to kind of navigate the cities without it costing a lot, because you know that there's those economic inequalities. The next is to make sure that the whole urbanization planning and the whole smart cities planning is based on inclusive design. And as I just mentioned, inclusive design makes things better for everyone. And so people who have strollers for children, or people who are cyclists, if you do not have a road that has a bike lane, I realize there's some people on the call who may not have roads that are as designed. There are some places where I live that it's gravel or just dirt and grass, and so that's not a reality. But to have that whole entire entire urban area set up for persons with disabilities, and so that they can also navigate these green spaces and have an access to going outside. Right now is a really good example with the COVID and a lot of people working or being at home, that some people can get outside. But if there's, right now there's a huge cumulative effect. If you need assistance getting outside, and then once you are outside of your dwelling, you need help, or you would need someone to push you, or you would need someone to help assist you to get somewhere outside, then it's not accessible, and people aren't able to get outside to get those benefits, those mental health, and also that social interaction, all the health benefits of that social interaction. It's just off the table for them. And so a lot of people I know have come up with really amazing parks and recreational spaces that's all ability parks. And this is fantastic. And it makes it possible for people of all ages and all abilities to participate in recreation. Make sure that that the outside is for everyone, and also that it's safe. And so sometimes that means also making sure that there aren't people who are interested in exploiting them, that people don't get called names while they're enjoying these recreational facilities. And one more element of SDG 8.5 that has to do with social inclusion relates to 10.2. It is the responsibility of the non-disabled persons and employers and citizens to not discriminate against the persons who have disabilities in the workforce and within the community, and when they go outside, to make sure that they are appropriate neighbors and good citizens back to them. And so all of this is work that individuals can do who do not have disabilities, in addition to those people who are global advocates for disabilities. I'm just reading that in Germany, that if you need assistance of any kind from the state, your earnings are capped. They take everything above a certain threshold, and you can't save. That is very interesting information. I was recently in Germany, and I noticed a large number of persons with disabilities on a lot of the public transportation. And I was wondering about this, because I know in different time periods there would have been less visibility. So thanks for sharing that. I wasn't aware of that. It's the same in Iceland, apparently. Okay. The next one I want to talk about for everyone, as far as leaving no one behind, has to do with climate change. And so I don't think that there's anybody here on the call from Southeast Asia, but so Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, and a lot of people in coastal areas, Iceland, I'm not sure about your tides because you're kind of in the middle of the world. Climate change is coming for certain areas disproportionately than others. And there's a lot of considerations when it regards to race, and also the economic level of your country and your development levels when it comes to climate change. And so, unfortunately, places like the Western Europe and other places that have had a long-standing industrial revolution, created all these problems we're dealing with now, disproportionately impacts places around the world, which is where the 80% of people with disabilities live. The least resource countries are facing the disproportionate impacts of climate change. But there's also places that are not least resource who experience a large number of climate-related natural disasters. And so I want to bring attention to the fact that climate change and persons with disabilities is maybe one act of the political, economic, and social inclusion that we don't talk about. And maybe we don't think about, but it's really good because there's so many people who are interested in today's Earth Day, which is a fantastic time to talk about this, but there are specific elements. So the Paris Climate Agreement does include making sure that persons with disabilities are part of the emergency plans, and also that they're part of that planning for what happens as climate changes. And so 13B goes back to 13B goes back to 9C and making sure that persons with disabilities are able to access the information, and a couple of the previous slides also, and making sure so you have a plan for what happens if there's a tsunami, a drought, an earthquake. What are some other natural disasters that hit you where you live? Some sort of ecological disaster. People with disabilities will be left behind in a disaster. People with disabilities who were in Japan when there was the earthquake and tsunami just a few years ago were twice as likely to die and be left than persons who did not have a disability. And this is also important because families of persons with disabilities are evacuated last in many areas, if anyone's evacuated, because there's some places where people don't get evacuated at all because they have a disability and because people won't be able to provide the transportation that they might need. So that there's so many areas of this that are really important. And so if you're a person, I know there's some folks on the call who are interested in climate change, and especially as Earth Day today, making sure that people who have disabilities are part of the decision-making process of what the emergency plan is. And also that's very important because Puerto Rico and Haiti and a couple of other places, I think Bermuda, Barbados, they live in an area of the world where there's, in Florida, there's hurricanes and cyclones. There's so many tropical storms and other places that are impacted by tropical storms. That when you have an emergency, what happened in Puerto Rico is that all the people who were deaf and hard of hearing had no idea what was going on. There was no electricity. There was no water. There had just been this hurricane which it flattened everything. And they don't know what's going on. If there is, for example, you have an emergency radio system that tells people where to go for aid. So say everyone's supposed to go to this earthquake-proof infrastructure. The people who are deaf or hard of hearing, they didn't have information about that plan. And they can't get information during or immediately after the disaster. And so they have to be part of that conversation. And the emergency plans have to be inclusively designed so that, okay, what are you going to do when your electricity goes down? What are you going to do when maybe there's some sort of, geographical barrier. So now there's like a river between you and the person with a disability. How do you get to them? How do you get food to them? How do you get assistance to them? And so this is something that's really, really important because this is something where we know they're going to be left behind, and they are chronically left behind in the planning as well as in the emergency response, which I want to say leads us back to 10.3 and 10.2, which is in an emergency, a person who is part of the disability community or the community of persons with disabilities, again, it's those attitudes and beliefs about who should be saved, who it would be harder to save, who will require more resources on the other side once we get to safety. And so this is also happening a lot for people who are being displaced by violence, people who are internally displaced and also displaced across borders. They can't access humanitarian aid, or their families have to abandon them because they can't get them through the treacherous trek to wherever the humanitarian aid might be. And so this is something that you're seeing in a lot of the areas that have refugee camps where the transportation of the displacement is on foot or even through caravans because people won't carry certain people. But it's important to see that, as we talked about earlier, because of the diversity of persons with disabilities, there's a lot of assumptions about the mental capacity or the ability to communicate or the mobility. So you could have a person who has a mental health or who has a cognitive or learning disability who is perfectly capable of walking to assistance, who's perfectly capable of walking through that caravan, who's perfectly capable and deserving of being rescued and evacuated during a climate emergency or another type of upheaval. And so we have to make sure that people address these types of making sure that people have those social relationships with persons who have disabilities, that people have relationships where a neighbor could come and make sure that that person has access to, I don't know, if you have rising water, a rooftop where you can get, or some other natural disaster, that they can take care of you and can help guide you to where you need to go. A person who is blind, or a person who is deaf and hard of hearing, a person who has an autoimmune disease or a muscular degenerative disease, they can still contribute to society on the other side when you get them there. And it's really important to remember that and to fight against beforehand any situation where we know that climate change is coming. We know it's going to drastically transform our access to resources. So food insecurity, water insecurity, as well as electricity insecurity. And so when going back to these climate related targets, takes us back to SDGs 1 through 6. So we know that poverty, hunger, health and well-being, education, gender equality, also access to water and sanitation, and then modern energy. Those are going to be the first things to go for persons who have disabilities. I'm seeing some notes about folks in COVID-19. The people to see closed captioning and sign language for folks who have been doing some of the emergency broadcasting. That's fantastic. And so if you do have say that you live in a place that doesn't have TV and you rely on radio, then how are people going to interact with that material? If you then have community workers who are going to bring written information to persons with disabilities who could see it, but they haven't been taught to read or how to communicate, then they're not going to be able to access that information. And so everything works together as a system. And so in order to leave no one behind, we have to do all of these things. And so wherever you or your community or your organization are, if you're looking for ways to get involved, these are some places to start. And there's so many places to start. And I realize it's a complex and wicked problem as far as like the solution's not going to be universal. So I'd love to see in the comments if anyone is having any ideas of different types of ways that they could take the information that you've learned today and maybe bring it to your community or a way to reach out to persons with disabilities to find out about what their realities are or ways to advocate. So if you have some ideas, I'd love to see them in the chat box, or maybe that's QA mode. I'll check both if you list a question and also in the public box. I've also just added a button for the Access the Learning platform. And so for everyone who's here on this training, peace is possible global. I've created an online learning application. It's a progressive web application that you just go into your search bar and you can do it from any device, tablets. You could use your desktop. You can do whatever you are. It's built for folks who live in low connectivity areas, even low electricity. And so you can download it to the homepage of your device if you want to, but it doesn't take up any space because I understand the different generations of devices that people have. But if you would like to create an account, it's free. It has all the information about the human rights as well as the sustainable development goals. All of this information will be in there. It also has information about how to build positive peace in your community. It has some recommendations, as well as it's going to have some links to partner organization training materials. And this afternoon, this evening, my time, I will include the human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights and SDGs are already in there, but I will add this presentation and the Convention on the Human Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'll add that this afternoon so that you all have access to that in one place. So please create an account and let me know if you're able to use this information. I try to make sure that the information is updated regularly, and you can just open up the app. You can just open it up, and then you'd be able to show someone these graphics. And so for those folks who had asked for more of a visual, all of the videos for human rights, the Sustainable Development Goals, and Peace Day are available in sign language, and they are also available in every language in the world. And so wherever you are, and also if you're a person who signs, they are available in sign language. And I've included those videos on the app on the application. And then once this once this recording is ready by our wonderful hosts, I will create the captioning for it so that it's available so that people can read it. And I'll include the text of the captioning for people who need it to be translated in different dialects and different languages. So are there any questions that people have? Do you find this information valuable? Are you finding it actionable, something that you'd be able to bring to your community? Also, there's the next event in this series, which is going to be the Women in Entrepreneurship with Mariana Levtov from JCI Switzerland, and that is going to be on May the 19th, and that is going to be from 18 to 19:30 GMT. And so, does anyone have any questions or comments that they want to share? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Perfect. And so I provided you with all of the different ways to start. And so if you need one actionable thing to do today, is to reach out to a person that you know. Another part of disabilities community is some are visible and some are invisible. Sometimes you know about them and sometimes you don't. If you know of a person who has a disability, or if you yourself have a disability, ask questions or ask to be asked questions about what you need and what would make an event or an organization or a policy more inclusive to you. And then ask the other people in your community and make sure that they're part of that decision making and making sure that their voices are heard. That's a really good place to start if you need a starting space. Amazing, wonderful. Well, I've so enjoyed engaging with all of you. Thank you so much for your time. And I promise to translate this video into captions in the next week. Amazing. You're very welcome. Also, if anyone knows someone who does sign language who would want to translate this video, let me know. That would be fantastic. Oh, there is a question from Germany about how to efficiently provide captions and translations. Google Hangouts has a live transcription option. I will look to see if this platform has a captioning. I'm sorry I couldn't find it earlier, but I'll look to see if this one has, Skype has it as well. And I think that now PowerPoint, I think that might be something interesting to consider, is that if someone had this, if someone had this platform up, and I'm sorry I didn't test it earlier, if someone had this platform up on half of their screen and they had on their computer the PowerPoint presentation, and they were doing live screen sharing instead of having uploaded a presentation, I think that PowerPoint now has live translations. Or you could record it and then have those, as far as webinars, already prepared. I'm seeing that Skype does it very well. So I will, yeah, that's a good question. Let me find out some other ways, because I know that there's been a lot of information shared about the best practices, especially in a lot of virtual events right now. Live translation is way better. Yeah, let me see if I'll look and see if there's some resources to share, and I'll put a whole folder on the Pieces Possible Global application that'll be for disability inclusion, and I'll make sure that all that information is in there. I'll do some investigation for you. You're so very welcome. All right, well, I've so enjoyed spending time with you today. I'll get this captioned for you soon. And anything, reach out to me. I think that you'll have my email address. If not, I'll put it here. And if you're on LinkedIn, I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn and make sure I can follow the work that you're doing. And if you have any events that do come up, or if you do take any initiative for advancing the inclusion of persons with disabilities, please send it to me. I would love to know what you're doing. That's fantastic. Oh, very cool. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I'm going to close out now, and I'll be in touch soon. Bye.